Like to answer a question I get asked in various forms, and it was asked again recently, which is there such a thing as a bad story? And I think there are at least three answers to that question. So, yes, I think is the short answer, but it really gets down to what do you mean by bad? Um, One way that a story can be bad, and I think the most um, overstated and least interesting way is in terms of its morality. Morality is not interesting to me. And the reason I say that is because when we're talking about the ethics or morality of a story, fundamentally what we're talking about is something that is incredibly subjective and the subjectivity of which changes substantially and quickly. Morality fundamentally is a fad. And you get into a situation where a story will be perceived as, moral or, good, bad, etc. At different times, in different time periods, um, one location to another in the world, within even the same city, depending on what household you're in, uh, what's good and what's bad changes radically. But that doesn't interest me so much. What I think is kind of interesting in there, though, is that you get very easily in literature, especially as a writer, you get very easily into these situations where you could be writing what you perceive as a bad story from a morality standpoint. One of the kind of unusual aspects of writing is that you can actually be producing, without intending to, a story whose morality you yourself object to. I remember distinctly once having a conversation with a student where I was kind of walking her through her story and explaining the morality of the story and like what the story was saying thematically. If it was taking on a particular social issue, and it was taking as a story a particular thematic position. And it was a very strange scenario where this character uh, were really the author of the story had written a work that she herself was offended by. Um, because there's just no way to make that story work in the other direction. To make the story work, the way that she had set it up, the terms of that story, structurally speaking, was that it was a particular story. It was advancing a particular morality that she herself, didn't even agree with. And there was really no way to fix it, without writing a new story. Like with all those elements, there was really no different combination. There's no way to really undercut it necessarily in that particular example. You can sometimes get those weird scenarios where you're trying to be didactic, you're trying to have a moral position as an author, but are actually undercutting yourself accidentally, and presenting this you know stories so easily fall into this ironic position. And so you can have a bad story sometimes in the sense that you actually are writing a story whose morality you yourself don't agree with, and you can be blind to that. You can be thinking you're writing this story that's advancing a particular social position, but really you're advancing the opposite. Authors do this quite often, actually, particularly authors who are trying to advance a social issue. An author trying to write an anti-racist story often ends up writing a racist story. I see it all the time in creative writing classes, particularly if you don't have a real uh, complex level of control over your story. It can go off the rails very fast. So there's bad stories are bad in that sort of moral position. Like, we might consider a story bad morally speaking. Um, but as the time changes, or as morality changes and shifts, or as we kind of maybe ourselves change our minds about things, you could very quickly, that's where it can switch from being good to bad and so on. So I don't find the morality uh, of a story interesting, except insofar as sometimes you can be actually writing a story whose point is the opposite of the point you're trying to get across. For that reason, I don't think it's super useful to be trying to get particular points across in writing a story, but that's just me. But the other way that a story can be bad, I think, is a bit more of an objective manner, although it is ultimately, I would say, subjective, which is stylistically or structurally. As storytelling, it could be a bad story. There are certain principles of writing, whether they're principles of storytelling or principles of writing style that do change over time. What we could consider good writing or writing well today is not the same as what good writing would have been 200 years ago. And in fact, reproducing good writing of 200 years ago would be seen as bad writing today. Having overly descriptive passages, too much thought, massive amounts of exposition, and so on. At the same time, tastes change, right? And what we consider good writing or bad writing changes as a result. But I will point out that it changes slower than morality. We can go back to Aristotle and see, that he is complaining about Deus Ex Machina endings, which audiences still complain about today. We've got 2000-ish roughly 2000 years of history there, and we still have the same idea about what is good writing for the most part that Aristotle did. Not entirely, but much of it is closer than you would think. But we can go back 50 years. We don't even have to go back 50 years, and we can go back, but we can easily go back 50 years and find stories the culture has completely flipped on a number of issues. So there's more stability in terms of good or bad writing. There's stories that we could say are bad from a storytelling or writing style perspective. But again, that's something that shifts and changes over time. You're always going to have somebody who's able to make breaking the rules work. And I try to do it consistently. That's half of my style is trying to ruin my own style. Trying to make things that don't work or are considered bad writing good. So sometimes I succeed, sometimes I fail, but it is very much possible to write a quote unquote bad story and actually do a good job. So that stuff does change, but there are a few things that fundamentally are hard to make work. I think the most interesting way to think about a story being bad, though, is in terms of what I like to, it's kind of, there's not a good phrasing for this. If you know anything about philosophy, and if you particularly know Alain Badiou, Alain Badiou has an interesting idea about fidelity to the event. He talks about what he considers truth as, and the good, in terms of fidelity to the event. Now, without getting deep into what an event is, according to Badiou, or without getting deep into his particular philosophy, which I don't fully agree with, but I like this idea of fidelity to the event, and I like the idea, the way that it can maybe be brought into writing, which is that fundamentally, if you consider the story to have a core, if you consider the story that you're writing to have a core, to have a sort of essential set of things that it is, a certain level of essence, not to be essentialist, but to argue that the story you're producing has certain aspects that are fundamental to it, and these are like the parts of the story that are the most interesting, the most valuable, in a manner of speaking. I think that a good story is as true as possible to the core of that idea. I like to call it going to the end of the idea. Like, I think a good story goes to the end of the idea, whatever it may be, whereas a bad story stops short. A bad story doesn't go all the way. In other words, it sets up idea, it sets up certain characters, it sets up who they are, or it sets up a premise, and it doesn't go fully to the end of that premise. There's I always use the example of the Transformers movie by Michael Bay. What I think, as soon as you take the Transformers, this kind of cartoon, ridiculous cartoon robots. If you take the Transformers, you take them out of the cartoon world. If you change the aesthetic, and now we're in the world of uh, sharp edges. We're in the world of giant, alien robots with sharp, crazy looking, warlike machinery. And we're in that aesthetic. This is the look and feel that we're at now. These robots don't look cute. They don't look like cartoons. Instead, they look like, you know, uh, spaceships made out of blades. Once we're in that scenario, and once we're trying to take at all seriously the idea uh, of these robots, I think the logical conclusion, once the core of that idea is that the robots would never engage with humans. They would wage war the way that we wage war. They wouldn't talk to the ants on the battlefield. They wouldn't even know that they were there. I think that that is the logical conclusion of that idea. So I would say, well, Transformers is a bad movie. It's a bad story, the Michael Bay Transformers. Although it has, its good aspects. Michael Bay is very good at certain things, but I would say fundamentally that's a bad story because it doesn't go to the end of the idea. To me, there's a really actually interesting idea. The only reason to make a live action Transformers movie, I feel, again, this is just my opinion, but is to go to the end of that idea, to put those strange machinery aliens into a world where you're going to take them seriously and then take them seriously. Of course he stops short. He's taking them seriously one moment and another moment is jokes. It's serious one moment, another moment is jokes. To me, that's a bad story because it hasn't committed and it hasn't gone to the end of its, it hasn't fulfilled its commitment to itself. So I would say, that's to me the most interesting way to think about a story being good or bad. Is it going to the end of its own idea?